And thank you to the Idea School for kindly inviting me. What I will try to do over the next few minutes, perhaps almost an hour, is to try to make an argument as to why the food systems which exist in the world today are worsening the crisis of malnutrition. And I will do this by showing a lot of evidence of how there has been relatively little progress in terms of reducing malnutrition for a variety of reasons. And this can be connected to food systems. There are, of course, a variety of food systems which coexist in the world. There are some food systems which are dominant and some which are less dominant. And likewise, at national levels, depending on the countries concerned, there's a similar coexistence of different problems. Let me first summarize to you what I see to be the major malnutrition problems. Firstly, there are the problems of hunger, which we normally associate with what are called macronutrients. Macronutrients are primarily carbohydrates and proteins. Proteins from both animal as well as from vegetable sources. The hunger estimates which we normally hear about coming from the Food and Agriculture Organization, but also others, because they all really depend on the FAO for their estimates, are mainly to do with what is called calories. So the FAO makes certain assumptions about the needed caloric intake, and for what is deemed to be a sedentary lifestyle. Okay, a sedentary lifestyle, meaning that you do not exert much energy in the course of life. Now, for such a sedentary lifestyle, a certain amount of calories or joules are required, and that is deemed to be the hunger line. Okay, so everybody who is above that hunger line, and usually this is done at the level of national estimates, although in some countries you have state or provincial estimates, is deemed to be, everybody above that line is deemed not to be hungry, and everybody below that line is deemed to be hungry. So there are all kinds of estimates about the relationship between incomes and caloric intake and so on and so forth. There are many issues involved there, and some people have debated and disputed these issues, including FAO staff, to their credit. But I think it's very important to emphasize that when the staff do their work, they are doing it basically honestly. I had the pleasure and honor of working with such staff for 3.5 years, and I do not feel that there is any basis for the claim that there is a conspiracy by staff to underestimate hunger. You might question the methodology. The methodology was one which was agreed to in the 1960s by the FAO, and it was actually proposed by an Indian food economist named Sukatme, if I'm not mistaken, and it has not been revised fundamentally since then. A second consideration, of course, is what is called, popularly referred to as hidden hunger. And here we are referring to deficiencies of micronutrients. And basically, we're talking about 2 or 3 different types of deficiencies. Deficiencies in mineral intakes, deficiencies in vitamin intakes, and sometimes there is an attempt to look at what are called trace elements. Without getting into the biochemistry of all that, these are all considered necessary for the human body, but the trace elements particularly are given very little attention, and much of the attention is on the main minerals and vitamins which are required for human life. The third element is of malnutrition, what are called diet-related non-communicable diseases. These diet-related non-communicable diseases are very widespread, but if you look at the literature today, the literature which is widely available, most of the literature focuses on basically focuses on questions such as obesity and overweight. and that is considered to be the main non-communicable diseases. But I would emphasize that there are a whole range of non-communicable diseases relating to food intakes or diets, and these include a range of diseases which are the main categories of NCDs, except for smoking, which obviously is not a food intake. But if you look at the NCDs, which are considered to be the major problems of contributing to human morbidity, these are very widespread. So I guess the point I'm trying to emphasize here is that our understanding of malnutrition is actually quite broad, but the focus tends to be fairly narrowly on hunger and what is referred to in the literature, in the official literature, as undernourishment. So undernourishment really refers to the caloric intake or joules intake, mainly related to the consumption of carbohydrates, usually from plant cereals. Now, the so-called prevalence of undernourishment is the usual measure of hunger which we normally find, and this is annually estimated by the FAO and as a percentage. Now, when I first joined the FAO about 11 years ago, I tried to make another assumption, and the state of food and agriculture of 2012 shows the assumptions which we tried to make. The assumptions were slightly different, where we looked at what undernourishment would look like if we varied the assumptions of what human beings require. So we looked at those who we dropped the assumption. Besides the assumption of a sedentary lifestyle, we also looked at people who did moderate manual work, and we also looked at those people who did intense manual work. Now, of course, you get very, very different results. But of course, the criticism of what we did was that human life has been significantly mechanized over the decades, and it is wrong to assume that people do expend a great deal of their energy on manual work. So the irony, of course, is that the people who are poorest, who do the most manual work, have to live with a fairly high threshold, given the kind of energy which they are required to expend. So it is not surprising that the popular prejudice emerges that poor people are lazy. They are lazy precisely because they do not have enough dietary energy to be able to work very hard for extended periods of time. So I think it's very important to recognize that there's a self-fulfilling prophecy as a consequence of this. Now, here we talk about the prevalence, which is usually a share or percentage, and the number of undernourished. And I want to emphasize something which you find in the literature, particularly the Sustainable Development Goals literature. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals literature, you will find that poverty has declined quite rapidly, according to the World Bank. But if you compare it with the FAO literature estimating the prevalence of undernourishment, you will find that the decline of hunger seems to be much lower, much slower. And this is mainly, this is due to a variety of factors, but it basically underscores the fact that there are many people who are likely to be undernourished because of the different measures employed in doing the calculations of the prevalence of undernourishment compared to the factors involved in measuring cash. So if you think, for example, about the number of people who have moved from the countryside to the cities. In the countryside, even if you do not have much land, you usually can get some food from around where you live. In the cities, this is very rarely an option. It can be an option in some circumstances, but it is rarely the exception rather than the rule. So even the transition from the countryside to the city urbanization, which has been extremely prevalent through basically over the last few decades, has probably meant that the value of money in terms of providing for adequate human nourishment has probably declined significantly. Now, I went through those definitional issues very quickly. And the next few slides, I will go through much more rapidly. But basically, this slide gives you an idea of the decline of undernourishment. As you can see, the decline of undernourishment was fairly sharp during the first decade of this century, and basically there was relatively little progress in the since the second decade, and especially since the middle of the second decade. Okay, so you will find that there has been very little progress in the prevalence of undernourishment as a consequence. Now, very quickly again, I think it's important to recognize that we often think of hunger being primarily due to not enough food production. That, of course, is wrong, because the distribution of income varies very considerably, and for most people in the world today, their food intake is very much defined by the ability to have a sufficient income to influence their food intake. So food production is an important consideration, but it has to be qualified by a number of other considerations. But between production and consumption, there are a number of important considerations. So while food production may influence food supply, it is important to recognize that there is an intermediate factor, and that is what are called food losses. Food losses refer to the loss of food associated with production. In other words, if farmers produce food and the food is lost, for example, to pests, to insect pests or to rats and so on and so forth, or it is lost because the harvested product cannot be stored due to dampness, early monsoon or something like that, and then you basically had food losses. Okay. Now, the other term which is often thrown around and used in this connection is what is called waste. And waste is used definitionally in the official literature in relation to consumption. So the distinction between losses and waste is really between production and storage on the one hand, and consumption, sale, and preparation on the other. Now, some people would say that transport is another important consideration besides storage, and you can add that to the first list. If you lose food in transportation, that will also fall into the category of food losses. Food waste is basically at the level of consumption. So you will find that, roughly speaking, not precisely, but roughly speaking, most of the food losses occur in developing countries. Usually the poorer the developing countries, the more likely they are to experience higher levels of losses in production, storage, etc. And waste is largely at the level of consumption. Now, the estimates of production of losses and waste are roughly about 30% respectively. Okay, 30+%. Okay, so of the total food output in the world, it is estimated that about 30% or up to 1/3 is lost, and then of the balance, in other words, the remaining 2/3 or up to 70%, that we have losses in terms of waste in consumption. In the manner which I described earlier. So, but because the losses take place in poorer countries and the waste takes place in richer countries, there is a difference. But it's important to remember that of the total losses, you have to deduct the total losses, and of that balance, that means about 2/3 to about 70%. Then you calculate your losses the waste in consumption from that 70%. But we are talking about different locations. Okay, so it's important to keep this in mind when you're doing your calculations about losses as in contrast to waste. So each country would have different figures, and the figures I was referring to are gross figures. Now, the question has been raised increasingly in recent years as people have been talking about, for example, last year was the 50th anniversary of a very key book published in 1972 called Limits to Growth. And some of you may have seen the report published last year by a team which included Jyoti Ghosh, who was the executive secretary for Ideas for almost 2 decades. Jyoti and her team and the team she worked with basically highlighted that there are great limits to fruit production being able to continue to increase. This is not to give new life to the Malthusian type of argument, but I think it is very important to recognize that there are limits to growth. And I mean, all of you who know anything about agriculture know, for example, you cannot indefinitely rely on soil nutrients to be able to contribute to plant nutrients. In many parts of the world, you do not have certain soil nutrients. In Anatolia, in Turkey, for example, not far from where the earthquake has taken place, there's almost no zinc, and so if you do not compensate for that absence of zinc in the soil, you will find that plant nutrition is compromised. There will be zinc in the plants, and that will in turn affect human consumption. The food which in other places you might rely on for your supply of zinc will simply not be available. So it's important to recognize these types of variations, but it's also important to recognize that with the decreasing amount of arable land which you have seen in the world, and with the greater and greater problems being posed by climate change and so on, it is quite possible that at least for many crops, the limits we are close to limits in terms of what can be produced, and in fact, in the case of some crops, we are likely to see a continued decline in the output. This is not to even consider some of the other artificial human-induced problems. For example, I'm sure you would think, for example, about the war in Ukraine and how the war in Ukraine has limited the exports of wheat from both Russia and Ukraine to the rest of the world, and very importantly, for the medium term, the exports of fertilizer. This has meant that both food as well as long-term prospects for food agriculture have been limited because of the higher prices of these foods. So this obviously has important implications, and there have been some estimates about what these implications are, but we still don't know. Now, let me move on very quickly now to emphasize that I've got a number of graphs and bar charts and tables, which I will just go through without commenting too much, because I still have a lot of other things I need to comment on as we go along. But this basically gives you some idea of the food production in the Asia-Pacific region. And then you have losses and waste estimates, which I mentioned earlier. And you also have breakdowns in Asian subregions, and also food loss estimates. That means in production in countries like India and China and so on. And then you can see here the relative price increases for different types of food, and you can deduce certain nutrients are being reduced as a consequence of price increases. So, for example, you take for example the main source of animal protein for many people in the past used to be fish. Today, fish prices have gone up so much that you cannot. It's very difficult to consume fish. And another source, of course, is chickens, and we find that, of course, chicken production and chicken egg production has been severely compromised. And alarmingly, the prices of fruit, vegetables, and fruits have gone up so much that now, especially in urban areas, there's been a significant reduction in vegetables and fruits. So particularly for a country like India, where there are many vegetarians and so on, and you rely on vegetables and fruits for much of your nutrient intake, these are all very seriously compromised. Now, let me move on very quickly to just remind you of some of the supply cuts. In the recent period, for example, you all know that there has been war, and war, I've already mentioned some of the consequences, but the response to war, particularly by the rich countries in NATO, has been to impose sanctions. And the sanctions basically, in an increasingly globalized world, which we have seen over the previous decades, now sanctions are the very antithesis of that. So you make countries much more dependent on imports, including imports of food, and then you introduce sanctions, which basically further raises the cost of food and basically food supplies and so on and so forth. And there was, of course, the prospect of both economic stagnation as well as food price inflation. But I would say that at this point, a lot of the food price inflation seems to be one-off due to the supply side disruptions of the pandemic and other factors. So we are unlikely to see more of that. So what we have now is a real threat of stagnation rather than stagflation. I'll be talking about this in about a week and a half in another session, so I won't get into that too much. But basically, you can see some of what I said earlier about the impact of war, and particularly on fuel, food, and fertilizer prices. But I want to also once again emphasize that these are almost one-shot increases, And for example, in the US, of course, the US is not representative of all countries in the world, but in the US, there has not been increasing food prices. So for those of you who are concerned about inflation, there is no. You also remember that when you studied your macro, that there's broad consensus, not only for people who are Keynesians, but even for more narrowly minded neoclassical economics. They are primarily concerned about what is called acceleration of price increases. Okay, and you don't have that kind of acceleration because these supply side disruptions were one-shot disruptions. And of course, you can say that the fertilizer prices, supplies will result in fertilizer price increases, and those will be more medium-term and long-term, but they are less dramatic in very important ways. And then, of course, you find that there is far less and far more politicized humanitarian aid available in terms of what, for example, the World Food Program dispenses. So you find that very often who receives aid and so on is politically determined, and this, of course, has important implications. So a country like North Korea, which has fallen out of favor and is in trouble. If there was a major hurricane or cyclone in Cuba, for example, you can imagine that there will be very little aid forthcoming for Cuba. So you can see how vulnerable many countries are, especially those countries which are in the hurricane or typhoon belts of the world. Now, let me just also note that there have been tremendous changes in malnutrition patterns due to changing lifestyles, due to changing diets and changing lifestyles. And these are very important. For example, more than 20 million people live in the vicinity of Mexico's capital, the Federal District of Mexico. And, and the distances are so far that parents who are both working often take about 4 hours a day, just on average. Yeah, I'm not talking about an exceptional situation. They take 4 hours a day going to and from work. And this basically means they have very little contact time with their children. Children are left to fend on their own. And of course, the most convenient food are fast foods, most of which are nutritionally compromised. So the implications are very, very serious. Of course, in rural areas, the situation is different than in urban areas, but it's important to recognize that more and more of the world's population are, in the case, are basically living in urban areas. Over half the world's population now live in urban areas. Now, women and girls are also discriminated against very much in terms of food consumption. And this, of course, has important implications. And these graphs gives you some idea of what is happening as far as women and girl children are concerned. Now, so when we think about malnutrition, generally we find that the attention, mainly due to the efforts of UNICEF, is on two elements. One is what is called child stunting, where babies especially and infants and toddlers do not achieve the body length, the body height, which is expected of them, and then the more difficult problem of measuring micronutrient deficiencies. So these are the two problems which UNICEF highlights. And then there have been other efforts to focus on adult obesity. And adult obesity, I want to emphasize, is a problem really of the well-to-do and the middle class. And in fact, many of the well-to-do are now much more conscious in terms of their diets and so on and so forth. So it's really of the middle class, old and especially the new middle class. So as incomes have gone up, for example, in Central America, now the rate of obesity in Central America, in Mexico, and other countries of Central America have exceeded that of the United States. Okay, for most of the 20th century, the United States was well ahead of everybody else. But today, it is no longer ahead. Many Central American countries are way ahead. It's also important to remember that there are only about 15 countries in the world which do not have significant malnutrition problems. So these are, again, some numbers to give you a sense of malnutrition. I won't go through them because Jessim and the school will make them available to you. But just to summarize, I think it's important for us to recognize that the problem is very, very serious. Now, I want to just qualify some of these numbers which I'm putting up here, because it is important for us to remember that, for example, problems of say obesity and overweight, the numbers look very high. Okay, they're 5% of GDP. Okay, of world GDP. Okay. Now, what does it mean when you're given a number like that? We are basically measuring the losses, for example, to the people in the United States, because there are so many obese people and overweight people. Okay, we are not talking primarily about relatively poorer people who are considered economically less worthy. Okay, the value, the opportunity cost of their not being able to work is considered to be much, much lower. So these numbers are really underestimates, and it's very important therefore for us to remember that. So these numbers, all these numbers which I'm putting up here, need to be taken with more than a pinch of salt, yeah. But don't take too much salt, because that will have very adverse effects for your health as well. Now, let me move on very quickly to talk about what is called hidden hunger, yeah, micronutrient deficiencies. I mentioned earlier vitamins, minerals, and trace elements. It's important the most important way of dealing with it is not through vitamin supplements. Of course, that is an option for people who can afford it, but it is really to have a diverse diet, okay? A diverse diet. And many of the traditional diets are sufficiently diverse, but of course, we have to recognize that very few people consume traditional diets anymore. And so people are living increasingly in urban areas where they do very rarely have these traditional diets. And it's important to recognize that you have diets which are very, very high in dietary energy, okay, carbohydrates, joules, calories, but low on micronutrients. That's why the emphasis on micronutrients. Now, of course, there are some low-cost options, yeah? One low-cost option, of course, is iodization. Okay, in India, many people take, for example, enough onions. Okay, but in many other societies, you do not have enough onions, and as a consequence, you do not have enough iodine intake. And in societies such as Anatolia, which I referred to earlier, you do not have enough zinc in the soil, and as a consequence, you have to complement that lack of zinc with suitable fertilizers. But of course, this rarely ever happens. Okay, this rarely ever happens, and you need to do very much more to compensate for the inadequacies in soil nutrition to ensure sufficient plant nutrition to ensure human nutrition. So it's a complex thing. This is very basic for people who are in the field of nutrition, okay? And any biochemist would also obviously see some of these issues. But unfortunately, very often economists tend to be blind to this, okay? They tend to measure too much in terms of currency, and that's why you have this huge disparity between poverty and undernourishment. But I would emphasize the gap with undernutrition is even greater. So this map of the world gives you some idea of micronutrient deficiency at the global level. And then you have various estimates for different parts of the world, which result in persistent problems for child nutrition. And much of the reason we have more data for child malnutrition is because of the efforts of UNICEF, okay, which is relatively better endowed than most UN funds and agencies. So you have child and maternal malnutrition, you have estimates of underweight. Delhi's here is let me remember what this is. Delhi. Well, I'll come back to me later. I'll tell you. But basically, it is a measure of the amount of the losses in terms of your ability to work. Okay. Now this is another bunch of estimates about nutrition undernutrition declining. But if you compare these figures to, for example, to the World Bank's figures on nutrition, on poverty declining, they are declining relatively slowly. I've drawn these graphs in such a way as to show you that there is a decline. But you can, of course, as you know, draw graphs very differently to give different impressions. But when you contrast this with poverty, you'll get a very worrying figure. The disparity between the two are very considerable. Then the estimates of the number of stunted children. This is a recent estimate. those of you who might have seen my earlier graphs on this, I have not seen this latest estimates for 2020, which I owe to my two colleagues who have kindly contributed to improving these slides. And then again, you see that the decline of stunting has been slow in the last 3 decades. Okay, there has been progress. Let me not ignore the progress, but I want to emphasize that this has been relatively slow. Now, wasting is even worse, than stunting. You basically, the body weight of the child continues to decline, and the damage to the human body is often permanent. So wasting is the worst possible condition, and is due to what is technically referred to as an acute food shortage. So when a child is cannot be breastfed by the mother, or the mother cannot produce enough breast milk, or at an older age, the child is deprived of food for various reasons, you have this kind of wasting and very often it results in death, especially in food emergency situations. So, for example, I had to estimate the number of people who died in Somalia, in the Somalian famine, where there was food available to be distributed, but it was not distributed because the Americans were very concerned that Al-Shabaab would get hold of some of that food. So they deprived the whole area, and between 200,000 to 300,000 people died in the Somalian famine of 2010-2011. There is besides the FAO study on this, there's another study done by Chatham House around the same period, and you can look at those figures if you're interested in this question. But similar studies have not been done in many other situations, and there have been many other situations which demand the use of such studies. So any type of war situation or any type of food emergency, for example, due to the floods in Pakistan and so on and so forth, actually demand that you have this type of study done thereafter. But very often we do not have anybody doing this kind of study. Now, I've already mentioned wasting, and what is called severe wasting is very serious. So in 2020, 20% of the children under 5 were subjected to severe wasting, okay, which is an extremely perilous condition. Now, here's more on wasting, on stunting, on stunted children under 5, stunting decline being slow. I think I did not delete one slide, sorry, for some 1 or 2 repeats. Okay, so this, I think, for some reason, I think, okay, this is a new slide, and this gives you an idea of the number of children who are anemic. Okay, and the demands of children are different for blood iron. So you can get blood iron from many sources, but the demands of girl children are much greater, because once the girl children reach a certain level of physical maturity, they begin menses. And for menstruating, you need blood iron, because every month you are shedding some blood in the process of menses. So the demands, the needs of girl children are very high. So even in a country like Malaysia, which is a relatively well-to-do country, a country which is upper middle income, on the cusp of becoming high income, we find that almost half the girl children are actually anemic, technically anemic, in the sense that they do not have enough blood iron. So this is a very serious problem. And Dr. Reddy, Srinath Reddy of the Public Health Foundation in India, for example, has estimated that has pointed out two things which are very significant. One is that it affects mothers' ability to reproduce and compromises their ability to reproduce and reproduce healthy babies in very profound ways. And the second thing, which I learned when he helped launch a report, which Professor Vikas Rawal and I and Michael Clark co-authored, was he reminded us that we often make the contrast between nature and nurture. Okay, but what he was pointing out is that nurture is transforming nature. So the young woman who has been nutritionally deprived, her physical nature is being changed. It's not the same as any ordinary woman who is not nutritionally compromised. So nurture is transforming nature. So the contrast which we normally make between nature and nurture is being challenged in very important ways. And this is something which I think needs to be studied and has been it's very not easy to study. You basically need a multidisciplinary study with different people collaborating to do the necessary measures. But it's a very, very profound and original observation by Dr. Reddy, which I hope some of you might be able to pursue and take up. Okay, so here we have some numbers on vitamin A deficiency. These are much older because I couldn't find newer numbers. Urinary iodine deficiency, which I mentioned earlier, and so on. These are some of the numbers which we have for Africa, which basically remind us and underscore how difficult it is in many, many countries in Africa as well. Now, the third element of our malnutrition story is that involving diet-related non-communicable diseases, diet or food-related. You know, people use the terms interchangeably, and the focus, as I mentioned earlier, is on obesity. In fact, the McKinsey Global Institute published some study on the eve of the second International Conference on Nutrition in 2014. And they highlighted the fact that after conflict, physical conflict, war, civil strife, and so on, which cost 2.1 trillion, according to the McKinsey report. The second highest cause of economic cost was due to smoking. Okay, the third highest, both of them at 2.1 trillion. The third highest loss was due to obesity and overweight. And I've already emphasized to you how biased that measure is. Okay, so you can imagine how serious the problem of diet-related non-communicable diseases is. Much more than just obesity and overweight, which tends to get the most attention. Yeah. And so, and these are often related to excessive sugar, excessive salt, and excessive saturated fats. It is wrong, in my view, to term this overnutrition, but the term has become popularized for certain people. So this is the McKinsey Global Institute I was referring to, and you can see there the obesity is as the losses attributed to obesity alone, not even the other diet-related non-communicable diseases, is supposed to be 2.2 trillion. And most of it, of course, is in the relatively wealthy countries and among the relatively wealthy people. Okay. Now, overweight and obesity has been growing. There's some very important work by people like Popkin, who wrote the book on nutrition transition and so on. This is a major, major concern in the West. But in developing countries, we do not see a comparable shift in attention. More and more people in developing countries are paying attention to nutrition, but you do not have a similar highlighting of the problems which are relevant in developing countries. And part of the reason is because the problems in developing countries are much more diverse. Okay, it's and for many middle income countries, there are people who are also who also suffer from obesity and overweight. So it's a very, very difficult choice to make. I'm not saying that we don't pay attention to obesity and overweight, but we also need to broaden our attention to consider some of the other problems in developing countries, but from moving away from obesity and overweight. Not moving away, but also to broaden our attention. But in Asia Pacific, as you can see here, the problems have increased, and much of it has increased relatively recently since the turn of the century. Okay, now so overweight under 5 kids in the Asia Pacific, you know, nowadays, of course, the new fancy term which the Americans are pushing is Indo-Pacific. Okay, but Asia Pacific actually is broader than Indo-Pacific. As you can imagine by looking at any map. So the South Asian adult obesity has been rising, just to remind you, and particularly it is very, very serious in Pakistan of all countries, and Sri Lanka. So you have it's not something which is very far away, and with the growing diversity, nutritional diversity in India as well, there is a real problem that this might also increase in India. Bangladesh, of course, has been growing quite rapidly in recent years, and already there are indications of this, and remember that these figures I have are quite old figures. Yeah. So moving on very quickly, I think one needs to look at how do we improve nutrition. So what do we mean by trying to improve nutrition through better food systems? How do we ensure that better food systems promote healthier diets? And let's face it, in any system which is dominated by commercial considerations, people are interested, the producers and the commercial intermediaries are mainly interested in promoting their products, and their products will need to be are promoted in various different ways, and very often substitutes are being made, and very often substitutes are being made for the purposes of convenience. I've talked to you earlier about the Mexican situation, but the Mexican situation is not unique. So as a consequence of the rise of so-called convenience foods, which can be easily prepared without the kind of long preparation of more traditional diets, what you find is that there is much more processing and including pre-processing of food. So you have, for example, in Southeast Asia, a great deal more consumption of what are called noodle packages. Okay, you basically have noodles which are either made from wheat or rice, and then you add a number of things for flavoring. Okay, these provide you with some calories and so on and so forth. They are very convenient, very easy. You can go home after work, you can go home after school, boil some water, just add the stuff, and it's ready to eat. But basically, it compromises your nutrition in very, very profound ways, and basically you reduce your vegetable and fruit consumption in very important ways. So how do we ensure that our social protection mechanisms, as limited as they are, try to overcome some of this? So in India, you have a food system where the government does provide food in different ways, and it's important for us to recognize that this can and should be combined with, for example, ensuring better farmer incentives to produce desirable foods. So, for example, I was involved in China, but other people have been know a lot about the Brazilian experience, where Brazilian farmers basically have strong incentives to produce certain types of food, especially certain types of vegetables, which are deemed to be nutritionally desirable. And this goes into the diets, particularly in school nutrition programs, and thus you can improve the school feeding program. Now, in the case of China, the minister concerned gave me too much credit. I don't deserve the credit, but what basically they did, I had suggested many years ago, right after the Olympics were housed in China, and the poverty center in China got one of the dormitories for the athletes, which it used to get some revenue, and they were basically involved in. I had suggested school breakfast programs to get children of poor parents to come to school. They actually ignored my suggestion, and what they did instead was a school brunch program. And when I asked them why they did it, their answer was very simple. They said, if you get the children to come to school and you give them breakfast, after breakfast they'll go home and help out their parents. But the way to get them to stay in school was to offer the meal later. And so what they have is a meal, not much of a meal, some gruel left over from the previous night, which they have by way of a breakfast. So it's very minimal, very modest, but it keeps them going until midday or so, where they have this meal. So then usually the parents would not be working in the early afternoon when it tends to be quite hot, and so there's less incentive to go home to help out. So in this way, they got fairly high attendance rates, but the parents themselves were involved in producing food for these school feeding programs, and the food they produce. So, for example, in many of these in China, they don't look at poor people. They look at poor regions, poor areas. And what they do is, for example, in an area which is deemed to be poor, there might not be enough, for example, blood iron, particularly for girls. So they started growing things like, I don't know whether you have this in India, red spinach. Okay, red spinach, which is rich in iron. And this red spinach was very important in terms of this red spinach was very important. Sorry, I'm so sorry. This red spinach was extremely important in increasing the iron content of the nutrition, which basically resolved some of the problems of anemia among children, especially among girl children as they were entering secondary school and so on. So you can solve these kinds of problems, but you also give an incentive to the farmers to produce much more of the important vegetables. And of course, when you say, okay, I'm ordering 1 ton of these vegetables, the farmer cooperatives cannot produce exactly 1 ton. Okay, they produce, let us say, for purposes of an example, 1.5 tons. Now, when they produce that 1.5 tons, they can only supply one ton to the school. But what happens is that the surplus of the vegetables which they produce are then sold in the local market. So slowly through this process, you basically get what do you call it? You basically get the farmers to produce more and more healthy. Sorry about that. You get the farmers to produce more and more desired vegetables, desired crops, and in this way, and also because the farmers are ultimately feeding their own children, they also do not use toxic pesticides and things like that. Okay, so you have a virtuous cycle in that way. and you can enhance that, for example, by having parents association ensuring that the food which the children are consuming are devoid of toxic pesticides and so on and so forth. So there are ways you can resort to try to enhance the quality of the food which is being consumed. So here are some more figures which I'm going to show you from Asia. The point I was trying to make earlier is dietary diversity. And dietary diversity basically means more varied food. Now, sorry, some of this are repeats, which I omitted to delete. Okay, so basically the government can intervene in different ways. Depending on the wealth of a country, what a poorer country like Nepal can do would differ from what a richer state in India might be able to do, and so on and so forth. So I'm not suggesting a one-size-fits-all solution, but you can see a variety of interventions which can be undertaken by governments to ensure that that you have a much better, healthier food produced, and you have much healthier nutritional outcomes. So I want to emphasize that healthier food not only ensures food security, but you're also talking about safer food. Okay, you're not encouraging people to have, for example, food which use a great deal of toxic pesticides and so on and so forth. So, but let us recognize that malnutrition remains very widespread in Asia, and it's important for us to take additional measures, not only at the level of production and distribution through government interventions, but also other areas where you basically want to try to improve the dietary consumption of families. So basically, and the way you do so is by reforming the food system. And the food system, depending on the country's concern, you can reform food systems in different ways. India has a long tradition of government interventions, public interventions, which need to be modified for the times. You can't just rely on interventions from the 1950s and expect them to be fit for purpose today. They need to be modified. And so you really need to rethink these kinds of interventions in order for them to work. In other areas, you need to ensure that there are enough incentives for the private sector. But the private sector should not be seen simply in terms of large corporations, which tends to be the case, but you really need to think in terms of farmers, including farmer cooperatives and other kinds of arrangements. And then you also need to have much higher awareness. For example, the book which Professor Rawal and Michael Clark produced, we had a picture of children in a school feeding program where they were eating eggs. And of course, this is a sensitive issue for some Hindus who think that eating of chicken eggs is not desirable or acceptable, and so on and so forth. But that was a deliberate choice, because let's face it, eggs are the simplest form of the cheapest and simplest form of way of transmitting animal protein. So it's very important for us to recognize this. Now, there is also a problem that in all the discussions which you normally hear about governance and how to improve governance and so on, nobody pays attention to nutrition. Nobody, because it is not a straightforward and simple issue, as I've tried to emphasize. It requires a great deal of hard work, of thinking about some of these issues, and therefore there's a tendency to let's go for the easy wins, the so-called low-hanging fruits. And what they mean by low-hanging fruits is a one-size-fits-all solution, good governance as opposed to so-called presumably bad governance. But what does it mean to have good governance? Typically, it means to turn things over to the private sector with some modest degree of government regulation. But we know that this doesn't quite work. And so we really need to think much more seriously about this. Now, I'm showing you a chart by BBGOC, who is the chief head of nutrition for NEPAD. NEPAD is the New Economic Partnership for African Development, and this is how they are seeing it in Africa, in the countries in which they are able to have some influence. But this some of it may be appropriate, some of it may not be appropriate. But the point I'm trying to make is that we need to really think systemically about these kinds of reforms rather than think about these issues as if they exist in the abstract. So finally, I want to raise a warning. Let us beware of false solutions. I'll give you an example. In Indonesia, there's a school feeding program run by Cargill. Okay, now Cargill has a strong vested interest, okay, in controlling the food in controlling the food business in Indonesia. Indonesia, of course, is the largest country in Southeast Asia by far, and so they have a strong interest. So when they come as big business directly or indirectly as philanthropies, and offer solutions, we have to be just very, very circumspect about what is being offered. And so on. Now, often people say you need market solutions. Well, when they say market solutions, I'm not against the markets. Markets can work very well in situations, but very often what they mean by market solutions is they're talking about solutions where big business, and very often big business want monopolies. In fact, the very antithesis of the markets. So we really need to think about how you ensure that farmer interests are also enhanced in these ways. Now, many people also advocate trade liberalization. I just want to remind you that with trade liberalization in Africa, Africa has been transformed from being a net food exporter in the 1970s. It is now a net food importer for several decades now. And the prospects of becoming a net food exporter are almost non-existent because, you look at, for example, at chicken feed. The chicken feed has to be imported from what do you call it? The chicken feed has to be imported from from the US or from Brazil. Okay, where they are basically using leftover corn after pressing out the corn oil or leftover soya. Okay, but this cannot be a sustainable long-term solution. So we have to think very, very seriously about many of the purported solutions. Yeah, but also be very careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. As abused as so-called market solutions are, very often market solutions may be the best way of mobilizing large sections of peasant farmers. Then we have to think about toxicity of many of the solutions, and how agroecological solutions can be the solution, but very often the promoters of agroecological solutions make exaggerated claims. So we have to be very rigorous with ourselves. Okay, I'm very much in favor of agroecological solutions, but it's also very important for us to make credible solutions, because ultimately farmers won't trust us if you give a solution which actually is not a solution which is acceptable to farmers. Then we have to think about how dietary behaviors are going to change. And of course, as we know in economics, in the last few decades, there's been far more attention to the determinants of human behavior, of consumer behavior, and so on and so forth. Many of these interventions need to be made very, very early. In fact, I would argue that prenatal interventions are often very necessary, because it is there at the prenatal stage where many of these outcomes are being determined, as Dr. Reddy and other people have reminded us. And finally, of course, the role of public nutrition programs. India has the public food programs, which many other countries do not have. So they are good starting points. Okay, they are good starting points. But many of these programs were constructed and developed at a particular stage and they need to be improved. Otherwise, they cannot deal with the challenges and the criticisms of the 21st century, especially in the third decade of the 21st century. So I want to thank you all for your attention, and I hope we have a vigorous discussion. Thank you very much.
Now we'll open the floor for questions, comments. So may I request you to raise your hands, people who would like to pose questions to Professor Jomo, and then I'll ask you to unmute yourself. We have some students in the classroom here. Let me find out if they can join.
Yeah. Hello, sir. Hello.
Yes, please go on.
Yeah. So with respect, yeah. Sir, I am Akash, and my question is regarding the non-communicable diseases. So there has been the acknowledgement that there is this epidemiological transition to non-communicable diseases, and with respect to the micronutrient deficiency problem which you are saying, so is it real? Is it real? I mean, should there be a real policy shift in global south or the developing countries per se with respect to NCDs? So you said you have some discontent since the proportion of people having the problem or the problem of NCDs is sort of, in a sense, more in the global north. So is this problem really into global south, and how should we sort of tackle it considering the other problems, for example, this micronutrient deficiency and all? Yeah.
Thank you very much for that question. It's an important and question. It also allows me to clarify certain things which were perhaps obscure in my presentation. What I was referring to was that once upon a time, there was a perception that problems of obesity and overweight are problems of the global north. Okay? Not all the other problems of micronutrient deficiencies, mainly obesity and overweight. And there's an extraordinary attention to overweight and obesity in the literature which comes from the West. Even in the West, the US is now no longer the largest country, as I pointed out. Mexico, the president of Coca-Cola in Mexico, he became, Mr. Fox became the president of Mexico in around the year 2000. And around the same time, Mexico itself exceeded the US in terms of overweight and obesity. Now, some people would point out that, Mexicans are in general many of them have been stunted, and hence the measure of what do you call it, the measurements of height and weight against the Central Americans. So you have a high measure of overweight and obesity in Central America as a result. I'm not.
Prof, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we've had a small internet issue here, so we couldn't hear the last minute of what you've been saying.
Okay, I'll repeat myself then.
Yeah. Kindly, please.
Yes. So basically, I think that was a very important and excellent question, which also allows me an opportunity to correct an impression I may have wrongly given. And the impression I've wrongly given is that this problem of NCDs is primarily a problem of the global north. I was referring to the perception that the problem of NCDs is primarily global north because of the media as well as the other focus on overweight and obesity. So the perception is that it is relatively better off people who are subject to problems such as overweight and obesity. Now, this perception may have been true for the second half of the 20th century, but since the beginning of the 21st century, we find that Central Americans, beginning with Mexico, have overtaken the United States in terms of the problem of overweight and obesity. Now, the problem of overweight and obesity suggests, okay, the upper estimate by my McKinsey Global Institute is of a 5% loss in potential output because related to overweight and obesity, because people cannot work and they need to be compensated and so on and so forth. But if we think about the losses due to micronutrient deficiencies, they are far, far greater than those simply attributed to overweight and obesity. So what I'm pleading for is far greater attention to many of the other problems of micronutrient deficiencies, most of which are related to deficiencies of vitamins and minerals, and sometimes more rarely trace elements. So these are real problems which we all face. But so this requires a focus moving beyond overweight and obesity to looking at some of the other problems as well. I'm not suggesting abandoning the concerns with overweight and obesity, but it's also important for us to recognize that there are other problems besides overweight and obesity of micronutrient deficiencies. For example, some of my friends during the pandemic, I'm of course much older than all of you, but my friends, they had very serious ailments because of excessive salt intake. So these are food-related NCDs, right? Food-related NCDs, and excessive salt intake, which are often related to hypertension and high blood pressure and so on. Also other problems related to excessive saturated fat intake, and so on. So there are a whole variety of problems. Now, which problems are most significant in a place like India, which is basically a subcontinental country? Okay, so you may have certain problems which are very significant in Tamil Nadu, which are different from the problems which you have in Assam, for example, which are in turn different from an urban conurbation such as Mumbai, for example. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution for any of these problems, but you really need to be sensitive to the variety of challenges which you face in the country. And of course, many of these problems, some of these problems do not offer easy solutions, but the easiest solution, generally speaking, is dietary diversity, and increase in dietary diversity, which involves greater vegetable consumption. And vegetable consumption is not especially expensive. But for example, in my own country, in Malaysia, for example, there's far less consumption of fresh vegetables. That more and more people are resorting to food which is bought outside of the home. And much of this might involve convenience foods, even food which is taken at home, which is prepared, for example, among young people like yourselves, students and young working people and so on. They often involve convenience foods, boiling noodles and so on and so forth. So you have a variety of problems due to the nature, the changing lifestyles which we lead, and which needs special attention now. But also we have to think not only of that, we have to think about the transitions which many people have made from rural areas to urban areas, the changes in their diets as a consequence of those kinds of transitions, and as a consequence of poverty, and as a consequence of their knowledge and their understanding of some of these problems. Let me stop here because I see a couple of hands up.
Yeah, we have two hands up. So may I request both of them to pose their questions one by one. We'll start with Mohammed Zulkifli and then Professor Mradulipan. Mohammed, can you please pose your question?
All right. Can you hear me, Professor?
Yes, please go ahead.
All right, Professor Jomo, thank you so much for your very insightful talk. So my name is Muhammad. I'm from Malaysia as well, but I'm currently in Durham University doing my PhD. So my question is
Muhammad, I cannot hear you. Muhammad?
can you hear me now?
Yes, please, go ahead.
All right. Okay, so let me just repeat the question again. So I would like to ask regarding the food system from the Malaysian perspective. So for the last 2 years, the ministers of education, which is Muslim Ali, he interested to introduce the free meal for the school students. And I know for the fact that, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you have stated in the media that, the food access for the students are vital for the kids, for the students. But, however, this policy cannot go through. And I believe that this is due to the hegemony of the market enforced by the nation states. And because of that, this initiative cannot be continued. I would like to know how we want to engage with the hegemony of the market enforced by this nation state, particularly when the nation state itself are not interested in food security, as we know that the reproduction of capital does not require the food security at greater extent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Mridul, if you don't mind waiting a little bit, let me respond to Mohammed first before I forget the question.
Sure.
Thank you. Now, Mohammed's question is a very important one, but I think rather than deal with the abstractions of market versus state and so on and so forth, I think let me deal concretely with the problem. The problem is whether or not there is the political will. Okay, and in the government led by Tun Mahathir, the Deputy Prime Minister Wan Aziza, she actually organized a meeting where Professor Wan Manan and I made presentations in Parliament to those who were interested in the issue. And we also provided some information to Dr. Mazli. Now, Dr. Mazli was the Minister of Education, and Ministry of Education has been running a school feeding program for many years. Now, the school feeding program is largely supplied by a couple of large food corporations, transnational food corporations. They have no interest in involving, say, farmers in this kind of food supply chain. So it is a question of political will. If you get say the Minister of Agriculture behind this program, and I believe that Mohammad Sabu, the current Agriculture Minister, would be interested. If you get the Health Ministry to get involved, Professor Wan Manan and others have visited, for example, a program in northern Johor, in Yongping and other areas, where for a budget of 2 ringgit. Yeah, for a budget of 2 ringgit, they were able to serve a meal to children in the schools. Okay, and that meal was partially supervised by parents involved, but the food was supplied was not supplied by farmers. Okay, it was supplied by other suppliers, and but not a single large transnational corporation as in the federal government's program. So you can the point I'm trying to make is that for 2 ringgit, and there has been a study of it which shows that the children involved in this Ministry of Health program were nutritionally better off. They were doing much better in terms of physical development as well as cognitive development or mental development after a year. In fact, after 6 months, there were already signs of this, and the study was published as a master's thesis and may be available. If you contact, if you look at the work which has been published by my colleagues and I at the Khazanah Research Institute website, or if you look at the work of published by HADAM. HADAM is the organization led by Professor Wan Manan, which has been trying to promote this whole idea. So this can be done. It can be done. Okay, we don't. I mean, I don't. Conceptual. It is not really the market as such, because you can organize markets differently. The first agriculture minister of Malaysia, Aziz Ishak, tried to organize markets differently. He tried to organize cooperatives, farmer cooperatives. And for his pains, he was removed as agriculture minister in 1961. And subsequently, he was removed as a minister completely in 1962. He went into the opposition, and he joined something called the Socialist Front, which existed in those days. And then he was detained in 1964, together with other members of the Socialist Front. Just people. I mean, people like Burhanuddin, who was the head of PAS at that time, Ahmad Bustamam, head of Parti Rakyat at that time, Pak Sako, Ishak Haji Muhammad, who was the head of the Labour Party. All of them were detained without trial from 1964 for different periods of time. The point is that such alternatives have been attempted, but they were frustrated because of powerful vested interests, including the vested interests you are referring to. So I would strongly encourage you to look at the book by Aziz Ishak called Special Guests, where he talks about the interests which were aligned against him when he tried his initiatives. The point is that it can be done, it has been done, but it has been frustrated. So this actually involves powerful interests fighting against farmer interests and so on and so forth. So I don't think one should talk about oppose the market in the abstract, but rather one should focus the attention on how powerful transnational business interests are supported. And unfortunately, sometimes we find that the powerful transnational vested interests are supported by nutritionists who are often rewarded for being supportive of the powerful transnational corporate interests by getting research funding, by being funded to go to conferences and so on and so forth. So there are an array of methods by which people, nutritionists are bribed to say the needed. That's why it's very important to have very strict rules about research funding and so on and so forth, so that you don't have a class of academic and other researchers who are basically beholden to transnational corporate interests. Let me stop here because there are two other hands up.
Professor Eapen.
Yeah. Dr. Jomo, this is Mridul Eapen from the Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum. And I work on gender issues, and I was very happy to see how specifically in your very rich talk you had mentioned about girls and women, and that made me very happy. But my question is something which has been in my mind for quite some time. You know, when you hear about these limits to growth of agricultural production, we emphasize the area deficiency, but one thing which we should actually give more stress to is the fact of increasing the subsidies. You see, agriculture can survive only with subsidies. I mean, given the nature of the commodity, the farmers can never raise their prices as can be done in other commodities or non-agricultural commodities. So it has to survive on subsidies. And I was a little surprised to see that in your government interventions, you did not mention at all the need to emphasize the fact that agriculture needs subsidies, and however reluctant the governments are to reduce subsidies, this is one area in which subsidies cannot be reduced, not only in food production, but also in production of other things which you show are very necessary for micronutrients, vegetables and animal proteins and all. Not only subsidies, but also insurance, animal insurance, crop insurance, which is what is dissuading a lot of farmers from going in for vegetables or for keeping ducks and chicken, because one episode of illness completely wipes them out. So somehow or the other, we don't think of the fact that this sector does need subsidy, however much we may be against subsidies otherwise, but this sector needs subsidies. And of course, we have to see to it that all the subsidies are not hijacked by the bigger farmers, but that is not happening. I mean, we don't think that all the subsidies are being taken advantage of by the bigger farmers. The smaller farmers are also getting subsidies. In Kerala, we see that. So I was just thinking why you didn't emphasize the fact of raising subsidies to improve production of food, which gives you micronutrients and including animal proteins. So that was my question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mridul. I appreciate your question, and I think if you look at the slides, because I went through them quite fast, I was very conscious of the fact that I was exceeding the time I was supposed to use. You will find that I was urging the provisions of various things to farmers, appropriate infrastructure and so on and so forth. So the question really is, how do you best encourage what you want to achieve? So if you are trying to encourage the production of certain types of crops, it can be done in various different ways. I mentioned the case of China, where basically, the red spinach is something which was very unfamiliar to people in highland areas, which is where most of the poorer communities were in not on level ground. Okay, let me put it this way. And so for them, even the simple act of introduction of a new crop, okay, which is what you call agricultural extension work, okay, and helping the farmers to grow these new crops well, was a simple act which involves subsidization, but I don't call it subsidization as such. The point is that you want to have particular interventions to achieve particular results. Okay, you cannot say one size fits all. If you provide subsidies, all problems will be solved. You need to be, I don't want to say targeted subsidies, because targeted subsidies also can be problematic in different ways. But I think you really need appropriate interventions. But I don't think we really disagree. It's whether or not I use the word subsidies, which you are understandably concerned about. And I'm basically saying you need to do what is right, what is needed in particular situations. So, for example, in Malaysia, where for example, some areas people would say, oh, what we need is land. You need land. But you cannot say that in Africa, which is generally where there is a certain abundance of land, that the question is a land constraint. So I don't want to give a one size fits all kind of solution. Precisely the problem is to identify the constraints and to address those constraints. So in Malaysia, for example, I have been advocating, my colleagues and I have been advocating integrated approach involving not only the Ministry of Education, which is responsible for school feeding. I want to just, by the way of footnote, point out that Japan, when it was much poorer than Malaysia, a century ago, introduced a school feeding program. And it was a universal school feeding program. Everybody benefited from it. And all children who were in schools benefited from it. So it wasn't as if it was reserved exclusively for the poor and so on and so forth. So, as my friend Wan Manan, I don't know whether he's on this program, but as he found out when he visited these programs, he found that they were helping each other. That their children were encouraged to help each other. Older children were encouraged to take responsibility for helping the younger children in primary school. They basically, much of the school feeding program was involved the children themselves. Okay, so there was a sense of participation and so on and so forth. In Brazil, for example, you have parents involved in so on and so forth. Now, in the case of Malaysia, I would say that it would be appropriate to revive cooperatives. The cooperative movement has been killed ever since the early 1960s. So not openly banned or anything like that, but slowly, without any support, the cooperative movement is virtually moribund today. So you would need appropriate interventions in different situations to achieve the needed. Now, you cannot expect one single farmer to produce everything which is necessary for a school program. You basically need to have farmer cooperatives to do the needed. There are alternatives to large corporations doing that. And this is what needs to be. So the interventions which are needed have to be appropriate, have to address the constraint at hand. And this is what our chapter 6 of the book, Vikas and I and Clark were involved with, emphasizes these governance constraints. And what Ms. Giosi from Botswana, the woman who developed the chart, the last but one chart which I showed, it looks slightly complicated because you didn't have time to look at it. But obviously that chart is appropriate for the country she was working with. They might not be appropriate for you in Kerala. Even in a place like Kerala, which is a relatively small state by Indian standards, you might find differences between rain-fed rice agricultural areas compared to other areas where different types of vegetables are being grown and so on. So I think what all I'm pleading for really is appropriate interventions which would support and rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think that is where perhaps, rather than just saying subsidies are needed. Because let's face it, infrastructure is a form of subsidy. You provide infrastructure, it's a subsidy. And that's precisely what has happened during the first Green Revolution, whether it will involve rice or in the south of India or wheat in the north of India. In Malaysia, it mainly involved rice. Particularly in areas which had been neglected during the colonial period. But right now, the problem is not a question of its adequate rice production. It is a question of people having enough vegetables to consume. And this is a major problem. So you would really need appropriate interventions. And that's really the point I was trying to make. Let me stop there. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Miridul.
Thank you.
Devahuti?
Yes, hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, thank you for the lecture. My question is you have somewhat answered it in the previous answer, but I wanted to know what you think a little more about what you think about agroecology and sustainable production. You've mentioned it a few times in your lecture, but what are your views on the International Assessment on Agricultural Knowledge, Science and Technology in Development? There's a report that came out in 2009. It acknowledged malnutrition problems and emphasized on the need to work with farmers and learn from their existing traditional methods that are deemed to be more sustainable than mainstream agriculture, which are more heavy on chemical pesticides and fertilizers? And what do you think could be the macroeconomic implications of these solutions that are being offered?
Thank you very much for that question. As I indicated earlier, I'm very sympathetic to agroecological solutions. And I think what the study which you mentioned from 2009 has been greatly complemented by subsequent work, including the work of, among other things, the Millennium Institute. But again, we're stuck with the earlier problem. We do not have one-size-fits-all solutions. And very often you find agroecological solutions which have been developed quite well and quite appropriately for certain crops, but not for all crops. And this is where I think it is important to recognize that we need agroecological solutions for all crops, all food crops, and some of them are still lacking. So we really need to recognize that so the work. I mean, I don't expect the work to come from some well-meaning researchers in the West, in California, and so on and so forth. It is the people in India, in Kerala, in other parts of India, in Asia, all over Asia. The problems which people face in different parts of Java are different. Different parts are different from what you face in Sumatra, what you face in Kalimantan, in different parts of Kalimantan, and so on and so forth. So all I'm pleading for is a need to find agroecological solutions which are already exist, and that knowledge needs to be shared, and there are not enough facilities to share that knowledge, because as you know, in many countries, agricultural extension work has been put by the wayside. And who is doing the agricultural extension work? It is often the seed suppliers who are doing the agricultural extension work. You cannot have the wolf looking after the hen house. You cannot have the fox looking after the hen house. You really need to have the government producing the needed options. But at least in some of the countries I'm familiar with, we do not find any vested interest, because you often have greater incentives for research which are looking, for example, at genetically modified options. So people are looking, for example, at genetic engineering and how genetic engineering might look, and so on. You have a lot of incentives to do research on genetic engineering in places like Oxford and so on and so forth, where this is considered state of the art. But how many incentives are there to do agroecological? So you find that many of our research institutions in our countries, and more importantly, the agricultural extension work, which should follow from research findings, are heavily biased against agroecological institutions. But that does not mean that agroecological research has all the solutions to all the problems we face. And that's why we need to, I mean, it took a long time, for example, for the problem which I referred to earlier, the lack of zinc in the soil in Anatolia, to be addressed. It took a long time to be addressed. And now, fortunately, it is being addressed. But there are a range of other micronutrient deficiencies which need to be addressed. Zinc, low zinc in the soil is not the only problem. You need to address other kinds of difficulties. So, for example, there are all kinds of vitamin and mineral deficiencies which need to be addressed. So, I do not want to give the impression that these are very easy solutions. The study you referred to was a very important contribution. There are a lot of other contributions which have been made since then, which greatly complement and supplement known agroecological options. But there are also gaps, and some of them are yawning gaps which need to be addressed. So I think the question is not at the level of one universal answer to the question, but rather the need to complement. Because why should a researcher working out of the West have a strong interest in the solutions to a particular part of India, for example, where you have some deficiencies in the soil nutrients. What kinds of problems, what kinds of solutions do you need to ensure that the agroecological farmer is price competitive? Maybe Dr. Mridul's point that you really need direct price subsidies may be very necessary in certain conditions, but we cannot say that price subsidies are always the solution. That's my point, really. So I appreciate the point you're trying to make, and I think what we have is a systemic bias, not only in the literature, but in government efforts, especially agricultural extension efforts, to begin to address these problems. And this is something which I hope will be addressed by efforts of not only yourselves, but your colleagues and friends who are involved in looking for agroecological solutions. Because a subcontinent like India is so diverse. A subcontinent like China is so diverse. Even a country like Turkey, which is quite big, it takes you several days to drive across Turkey. It's so diverse that you cannot say that there's one simple solution to all the problems of Turkey. So it's very important for us to recognize the diversity which exists and to recognize the diversity which is needed in terms of our solutions, and to recognize that there's a significant breakdown in international trade right now, with the endorsement of sanctions as part of what is politely called economic statecraft. It is nothing less than laying a state of siege. We need to recognize it for what it is, but at the same time, we need to address that. And sometimes you have people people in India are far more aware of the availability of solutions and the gaps in these availabilities. So, if you talk to many people who are much more familiar with Indian agriculture than I am, they will tell you where the solutions do exist and where the gaps do exist and what kinds of support is needed. So the kinds of subsidies which Dr. Mridul was referring to are probably very much needed in certain areas, but the nature of the subsidy may also differ. You might need a price subsidy, you might need a fertilizer subsidy, you might need different types of subsidies in different types of solutions, in different types of situations. So all I'm cautioning against is a simple one-size-fits-all thing to claim, for example, that all the agroecological conditions already exist. Agroecological solutions already exist, or on the other hand, the worst thing is what is being claimed right now: agroecological solutions do not exist. Okay, which is the current claim. Both are misleading, and we need to recognize that there are many agroecological solutions, but we also need to recognize that there are gaps, and this is where the agronomic research community needs to fill these gaps. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
We have a couple of minutes. If there is one or maybe a couple of questions we can take.
Jasim, you are the moderator, but you are also a researcher in this area. You may have your own questions. You might have your own answers, in fact, which are probably better informed than I am, since I know very little about Indian agriculture.
Yeah, thank you, Jomo. While we wait, if there is another question, I would just like to announce to the audience that Professor Jomo Sundaram will come back for his second lecture on the 25th of this month. Same time, Indian time, 4:30 p.m. GMT 11 a.m. For the second lecture. So That's one. And a second announcement I would like to make is about...
Jasim, you might want to say what the lecture is about.
Yeah. Jomo, can I let you say that? Yeah.
Well, it's basically about how the world is being dragged into a very dangerous situation with the combination of higher interest rates and the threat of war. A war by not only by military means, but also by economic means. And how this threat is a very, very dangerous threat. I would argue that it is even more dangerous than the situation in the 1980s. And 1980s basically set back Africa by 2 decades or more. It set back Latin America by over a decade, and we have to be very, very mindful. This time, unlike before, Asia is far, far more indebted. The debt is mostly commercial debt, and so we really need to be much more prepared for the current problem. And my simple recommendation is that we need a new non-alignment appropriate for our times. Sorry, Jasim, please carry on.
Yeah. And so 25th of this month is Professor Jomo Sundaram, and the other lecture that I would like to announce, which is also open to public, is by Professor Barbara Harris White, which is on the 17th, 2 days from now, same time, 4:30 p.m. Indian time. It's on the informal economy, self-employment, and petty production, framing macro and micro political economy. So I have shared the link to register for this lecture by Professor Harris White. Those who are in the audience are requested to go to our courseware website and register for this if you're interested. If there is anybody wanting to ask a question, please raise your hands. And if not, we could close the session. Yeah, I think we can.
Nasim, if I can just intervene and just say, yes, that Professor Harris White has been working on India for more than half a century, and she has very, very profound and important insights which are not exactly mainstream. I think she has recently retired from Oxford, if I'm not mistaken, and I think many of us who are not working on India will also benefit a great deal from her insights. So I would strongly recommend Professor Harris White's lecture for those of you who are interested. But thank you very much, Jasim, and thank you all for your attention. And thank you also especially to Muhammad Zulkifli, Dr. Mridul Ipan, and Devahuti Sakar for excellent and important questions which allowed me to clarify many things which I probably went over too rapidly without giving the necessary nuance, which is very important for all of us who are trying to make a difference. It is important to be very nuanced in terms of addressing the challenges which we face. So thank you all for this opportunity. And for those of you interested, I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, Jomo. On behalf of us, all of us here at the Idea School, on behalf of students who are registered for the course and all the others who've joined us today, a very big thank you to you. We look forward to your next lecture in a few days, and we look forward to continued engagement in the Idea School program. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.